Hello, everyone. My name is Tracy McLeaf, and I'm a biologist for the Fish and Wildlife Service at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. I'm glad you could join us today for our October installment of the Monarch Conservation Webinar Series. Here to introduce today's topic is Wendy Caldwell from the Monarch Joint Venture. Wendy?
Thanks, Tracy, and hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. As Tracy mentioned, my name is Wendy, and I'm the coordinator of the Monarch Joint Venture. I'm also joined by Shelby, who is our education assistant. Today, Karen Oberhauser and Cathy Downs are joining us for this program called Meet the Monarch. Karen is a scientist and is also a professor at the University of Minnesota. She's been studying and teaching about monarchs for over 30 years. Cathy is an environmental educator in Texas, where she's provided over 65,000 children and teachers with monarch education. If any questions come up during today's presentation, Shelby and I will be monitoring the chat box, where we encourage you to ask those questions. We'll have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation where we will answer some of those questions with Karen and Cathy. Since you won't be able to talk directly with Cathy and Karen, this chat box will be your main way of communicating with us. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Cathy to get us started.
Thanks a lot, Wendy. Okay, hello, everyone. I want you to know that I'm a citizen scientist, and that means I'm an amateur or a non-professional scientist that volunteers to help scientists with their research. And one thing I never, ever get tired of is doing research on monarch butterflies. So I learn something new about them all the time, and you, too, can be a citizen scientist. Well, when I first started studying monarch butterflies, one of the first things I needed to know was what kind of an animal is the monarch butterfly. So I had to put it in a certain category. We call this classification. Scientists have organized living things in order to better understand and learn about them. So they use their physical features as well as other kinds of information like genetics to classify them by the things that are alike or their similarities. By using Latin names, everyone in the whole world can talk about the same living things in the same way without confusion. This system is called taxonomy. The system's always changing, and we learn more about organisms on Earth. So let's look carefully at the physical features of the monarch butterfly that we see on the slide. Let's try and discover the large class of animals that it belongs to. What features do you observe? I see a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, but I also see antennae and legs, what I would call a forewing and a hind wing. But the greatest similarity the monarch butterfly has with many other animals is its exoskeleton, 2 compound eyes, 3 body parts that we see here, and 6 legs. So they're put into the class of insects or insecta. But we can go even further in taxonomy and find out which order our insect belongs to. Okay, so here we have a slide magnified of the monarch butterfly wing. Our insect has scales and other characteristics that they share with moths. So they're put into the order Lepidoptera. All butterflies and moths belong to the order Lepidoptera. And the word Lepidoptera is from Greek, lepido for scale and ptera for wings. Insects of this order have flattened scales that cover the body and wings of most adults. What do the scales on this monarch wing look like to you? You can answer that question in the chat box, and Wendy and Shelby will look at your answers and see how you do. The scales of a monarch and other butterflies can be removed pretty easily by the slightest touch, but monarch scales are attached more firmly than most of those. And the scales serve some pretty important functions. They increase the wing's weight and they increase the wing's heat retaining capacity because they're filled with air, and they also serve to insulate the body. Scales are also important to help flight, and they generate thrust, which moves monarchs through the air. That's especially important for monarchs because they need to be long-distance flyers. Scales also give butterflies their amazing color patterns. In some butterflies, they reflect light in ways that makes them look different colors when the light is or is not hitting them. Let's look at another couple of examples or models of orders in the class Insecta. This insect is in the class Diptera. The word Diptera is from the Greek di, meaning two, and ptera, again, meaning wings. Insects of this order use only a single pair of wings to fly. This insect is a parasitoid. Name two ways that this fly is different from a butterfly. And I'm going to ask you to also put those answers into the chat box. Karen's going to talk about parasitoids and predators a little later in the program. Here's one more example, and I bet lots of you have already seen this insect. This insect is in the class Coleoptera. The word Coleoptera is from the Greek koleos, meaning sheath, and ptera again, meaning wings. Insects of this order have two pairs of wings. The front pair are like a shell of protection for the rear pair, which covers the beetle's abdomen. Do you recognize this insect? Of course you do. If you've ever held a ladybug, you can see why they named it sheath wing. Which part of the names of these three orders are similar? Para, or wings. But how are they different? They're different in the number and kind of wings. We can see that the word para is common in the classification of winged insects. All insects change in form as they grow. This process is called metamorphosis. There are two kinds of metamorphosis. These include complete and incomplete. An example of incomplete metamorphosis might be a grasshopper, which has no pupa stage. The monarch butterfly undergoes complete metamorphosis, where there are 4 stages: the egg, the larva, the pupa, and the adult. There we go. All right, so we know the body of the adult butterfly is divided into the head, the thorax, and the abdomen, but there are also other structures on the butterfly's head. This one here, let's see if we can bring this up. All right, this is the proboscis. The monarchs eat with this proboscis. It's a long, narrow tube that works very similar to a drinking straw. When the monarch butterfly first comes out of its chrysalis, the proboscis is actually in 2 parts. But by zippering or fusing these 2 parts together, it creates a central canal called the food canal. It's through this canal that the butterfly draws food into its digestive system. Now, butterflies and moths can only feed on liquids, or liquids that contain only very tiny particles, small enough to fit through the food canal. When it's not in use, the butterfly curls up its proboscis and tucks it underneath its head. The eyes of a butterfly are enormous compound eyes. These eyes give butterflies an excellent sense of color and motion in a wide range. They can look up, down, forward, backward, and to the side, all at the same time. But they don't see like we do in one big picture. They really look like a bunch of still pictures in a row. But they use this vision to find flowers. When they land on a food source, they have taste receptors on their feet to find the nectar. That's right, butterflies taste with their feet. The 2 antennae that they have are covered in over 16,000 scales or hairs. These scale-like sensors give monarchs a sense of smell, and that enables them to locate sources of nectar. So butterflies smell with their antennae and taste with their feet. Female monarchs lay their eggs only on milkweed plants. What we see in the slide here are several different kinds of milkweed plants. When the egg hatch, milkweed's the only food that the caterpillars can eat. There are over 140 different kinds of milkweed, so there's sure to be some kind of milkweed near where you live. Many places in the country where monarchs used to be able to find milkweed have been replaced with houses and roads and buildings and large farms and other types of agriculture. So it's really important now that we find new places to plant milkweed. We're going to talk about that later in the program, and you can help us to think of new ways to plant milkweed and where. Do you know why they call it milkweed? Let's think about that for a minute. Why do they call it milkweed? Well, if you break a milkweed leaf, you'll find that a milky sap called latex comes out of it. This sap contains chemicals called cardiac glycosides. The larvae are able to eat the chemical without getting sick from it. By eating the milkweed and absorbing the chemical, both the larva and the adult are toxic or poison to many predators or things that want to eat them. So they'll avoid monarchs because they learn that the larva and the adult taste bad and will actually make them vomit. They learn to recognize the color of the monarch larva and adult. Birds and other vertebrates, or the things with backbones, will leave them alone. There's also another butterfly called the queen butterfly that you may have seen. That butterfly also eats milkweed as a larva and is also toxic to most vertebrate predators. Now, the sap from milkweed can be very irritating, so I want to talk to you for a second about milkweed safety. If you're in the milkweed patch or you're working with larvae and milkweed in your school or home, we need you to be very, very careful not to rub your eye when you're collecting or working with larvae around milkweed. Always wash your hands thoroughly after working in the garden. If you think you might have some sap in your eyes or your eyes start to burn, see an adult immediately and flush your eyes out with water right away for about 15 minutes. If your eyes still burn, you may need to see a doctor and get some ointment. Okay. Butterflies don't actually care for their young after the eggs are laid, but they do lay their eggs on or near a food source. This food source is actually called a host plant. So we know now that the only host plant the monarch butterfly uses is called milkweed. But the female butterfly lays its eggs, or oviposits, one egg at a time, often on the bottom of a leaf like you see here, or near the top of the milkweed. She can lay anywhere from 100 to 300 eggs or more, and actually travels up to 50 miles to find enough milkweed for her eggs. Each egg is surrounded by a hard outer shell called a chorion. This protects the developing larva or caterpillar inside, and the raised area you see on the egg are called ridges, and they're formed before the egg is laid. Now, this is a very highly magnified egg. They actually look more like this, and are about the size of the head of a pin. Monarch eggs hatch about 4 days after they're laid, and like many insects, when the caterpillar hatches from the egg, it eats its eggshell. Why do you think a monarch caterpillar eats its eggshell after it hatches? Let's answer that question in the chat box. All right. The word larva refers to the growth stage of all insects with complete metamorphosis. We use the word caterpillar, but only for a butterfly or moth during this stage. Most scientists use the word larva, but both caterpillar and larva are correct. So this is the stage where the monarch butterfly does all of its growing. The larva eats most of the time, taking very few breaks even to rest. It grows almost 2,000 times its original size. You know that if you were born a monarch larva, by the time you were ready to pupate, that you would be as large as a school bus. When the larva becomes too big for its skin, it molts or sheds its skin. Here's another question for you. What other animals do you know that molt or shed their skin? Another question for you to put in the chat box. The old skin will peel back from the front of the larva to the back, and the new skin will harden really soon. The shed skin is something else that the caterpillar will eat before it eats any more plant food. These stages between each of these molts are called instars, and the the best way to tell the difference between the different instars is to compare the size of the head and these tentacles. See these black things that stick out at both ends of the larva? Those are tentacles. The rest of the body grows within each instar, but the head size stays pretty much the same. Can you find all 5 of the instars in my picture? Okay, what we're going to do now is I'm going to put up 5 slides. We're going to count each instar as we go. So we see here the first instar, and you'll notice he doesn't have a whole lot of color yet, but he hasn't really started to eat milkweed. Once they start to eat the milkweed, the chemicals in the sap will give him this bright color. So here's our first instar, second instar, third instar, fourth instar, and fifth instar. At this point, they're almost as long as your finger. Beautiful colors and long, long tentacles. Let's look at these guys. This is a couple of examples of instars that look very different from each other, but look at them closely and think about what we've just discussed. Are these instars in the same stage or different stages? These are both second instars. The instar on the right has just molted from a first instar into a second. The instar on the left is molting soon from a second instar into a third. How about these? These are both fifth instars. We have to wonder what makes the size so different. Well, it could be any number of things. It could be nutrition or disease or even extreme temperatures. But if we look at the head sizes and the size of the tentacles, we see that they're very similar. Butterflies pupate and form a chrysalis, as opposed to a moth who might spin a cocoon. The major difference between the chrysalis and the cocoon is that a chrysalis is the hardened body of a butterfly pupa, whereas a cocoon is an outside structure or an external structure built or constructed by the larva to protect themselves during the pupal stage. Just before they pupate, the monarch larva will spin a silk mat or a stub from which they hang upside down. The silk comes from a spinneret on the bottom of the head. When it is ready to shed its skin for the last time, the larva stabs the stem, which extends from the rear end of the larva into the silk pad to hang, and the stem is called the cremaster. When it pupates, a monarch larva will split its exoskeleton, wiggle out of its larval skin. You can see many different body parts on the pupa, including the eyes, the wings, the legs, the proboscis, and the antenna. Then it develops a hardened cuticle or covering, and the pupa stage will last about 12 days. Look in this picture and see if you can find the pupa or chrysalis. What kind of defensive adaptation do you see here? Well, it blends pretty well into the green milkweed leaves that it's hanging from. So it has a sort of camouflage. The monarchs need to inhale oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide during the pupa stage, so they have tiny openings called spiracles. The oxygen enters the spiracles, and the carbon dioxide exits through the spiracles. Probably the most common question we get about the pupa or the chrysalis is, why does it have those beautiful gold spots? Did you know that the word chrysalis comes from the Greek word for gold? The chrysalis spots aren't real gold, but they look and reflect light a lot like real gold does. But we're not really sure why the chrysalis has gold spots. Here's some hypotheses or some possible answers to the questions of why they have gold spots. It could be camouflage, it could be warnings to predators, or they might not have any function at all. The pupa or chrysalis stage is going to take about 10 days, depending on how warm or cold the weather is. As the pupa develops, we can see through the cuticle covering. The scales start to develop and get colors. So when we see the chrysalis look this way, we know that we're very near the time when the monarch will eclose. When the butterfly emerges from the pupa or it closes, they'll immediately hang their wings upside down to expand them and dry them. And the abdomen is very large and full of hemolymph or insect blood. The abdomen starts to beat or pulsate like a heart, and it pushes and circulates the hemolymph into the entire body of the butterfly, fills the wing veins, and the veins give the wing structure, support, and strength. It's going to take about 3 to 4 hours for the wings to completely dry and fill, and these adults usually emerge somewhere around the middle of the morning, because if it's colder than 60 degrees, they really can't fly very well. So by the middle of the morning, it's usually warmer, and they'll have time to bask in the sun and get quite a bit stronger before they fly and begin to look for nectar. Let's see if we can't watch a video of the monarch butterfly eclosing from its chrysalis. This might take just a minute. What I want you to notice here is that a little bit of air is going to be between the cuticle and the butterfly, and the butterfly comes out, its abdomen will come out first. She'll grasp onto the cuticle with her legs and hang everything upside down. The wings are very crumpled and moist, and she sure can't fly at this point. If you watch very closely, you can see the pulsating abdomen, the beating abdomen, moving the hemolymph into the wings and the rest of the body of the butterfly. You can even see the proboscis start to work here. She rolls and unrolls the proboscis, zippering or fusing that canal together that we spoke of. Thank you for that. That's a great video. Once the butterfly is dry and it warms up, and she'll start flying for nectar. And this will take a little bit of time. If you can raise monarchs in your classroom, you'll be able to watch these things up close. Okay, let's talk about a male versus a female. Okay. The job of the adult stage of the butterfly is to actually reproduce or mate and lay eggs that become the next generation. Monarchs will mate when they're about 3 to 8 days old, and they'll remain together up to about 16 hours. Adults in the summer generation live from 2 to 5 weeks. Look at the picture here and observe very closely, and let's see if we can tell the difference between the male and the female monarch in the picture. Do you see these 2 black spots or pouches on the hind wings of the male monarch butterfly? This is one way that we can tell the difference between the male and the female. We also see that the female butterfly has much thicker veins. All right. So monarch butterflies that are born in late August and in the fall are very different from all of the other summer monarchs, even though they look the same. They're the only generation that will live longer than about 5 weeks. They migrate, and they migrate to the overwintering grounds, and they'll live up to 8 or 9 months. These monarchs won't mate or lay eggs until the following spring. This condition is called diapause. Instead of mating and laying eggs, they're saving their energy for their long flight. Some fly over 2,500 miles to find their overwintering grounds. They'll store fat or lipids in their abdomen. This will be the fuel for their flight that they gather from nectar or blooming plants all along the way. Scientists find that the monarchs save energy by gliding, using air currents as they travel. But the big mystery is, how on earth do they find the overwintering sites every year? Somehow they know their way, even though they are the great-great-great-grandchildren of the butterflies that left the previous spring. What other animals migrate, and why do monarchs migrate? Let's think about that for a minute. What other animals migrate? Did you think about birds? Birds will migrate to nest and to move to warmer areas and for food. Did you think about whales? Whales migrate to breeding grounds. How about elephants? Elephants will migrate for water and for better feeding grounds. And of course, we know that monarchs migrate, but why? Well, monarchs cannot survive a long, cold winter under certain conditions. Now, they can live at temperatures as low as 19 degrees, but if monarchs get wet and temperatures fall below 29 degrees, they will die. So they can't survive the snow and the ice. Let's talk about the migration. Monarchs actually have two entirely different populations, east of the Rocky Mountains and west of the Rocky Mountains. The monarchs west of the Rocky Mountains actually migrate to the California coast, where they roost in eucalyptus trees, pines, and cypress. Monarchs east of the Rocky Mountains migrate to the mountains of central Mexico, where they overwinter in oyamel fir trees and other firs and pines. Monarchs in Arizona, well, we're going to find out some more about them in just a minute. The eastern flight pattern is like a giant cone with millions and millions of butterflies coming together, and they actually pass right over the state of Texas on their way south. The sites the monarchs use have to have very special conditions. Let's just go and take a look specifically at these migrations. Okay. As winter ends and the days grow longer, the monarchs become more active and begin to mate. So they begin to lose their roots in the middle of March, and they fly north and east looking for milkweed plants on which to lay their eggs. These monarchs have already survived a long flight south and a long winter's cold, and they've escaped predators and other hazards. So the females are laying milkweed plants as they fly. That's the fall migration. Okay, so let's talk about these characteristics. So these sites have to have certain conditions. And it includes having water for them to drink. The climate and the surrounding area are important. They have to have underbrush, fog, and clouds. All of these have to form a natural ecosystem, making the perfect winter habitat. So in Mexico, those conditions are oyamel fir trees, like you see here. These fir trees are actually collected in a very small area on mountaintops in central Mexico, almost 2 miles above sea level in California. There are eucalyptus trees along the California coast. But on sunny days, it can warm up enough sometimes to fly to nearby water where they'll drink. They have to fly back to the roots, though, at night before it gets too cold. Okay, now we'll talk about spring migration. So spring migration is when it starts to warm up and they get more active and they're going to fly north. And they'll start out mating and laying eggs through Texas and spreading out toward Florida and into some of the plain states. It's at this point that those monarchs that have lived 8 or 9 months after laying their eggs will die. The caterpillars and eggs there, living to adulthood, will now raise new generations, moving all along the eastern coast, up into the higher mountains and summer breeding areas, all the way to the very south of Canada. Now let's look at Arizona. Do all of the butterflies in Arizona migrate to the same place? Take a minute to look at our tagged recoveries here. So we've tagged monarchs in Arizona. And put your answers, please, in the chat box. What did the people in Arizona find out by tagging monarch butterflies? Did they all overwinter in the same place? Certainly not. It appears that butterflies in Arizona and New Mexico have made some choices. Butterflies in Arizona flew to California, and butterflies in Arizona also flew to Mexico. Butterflies in New Mexico flew to Mexico, and butterflies in Nevada flew to California. By tagging butterflies, we've learned a lot about migration. We'll talk about some of these citizen science projects that you can do later in the program. All right, we're going to talk now a little bit about these annual cycles. The life cycle of a monarch is really only one generation, from egg to adult. There are 3 or 4 generations of monarch butterflies every spring and summer. Since each female lays hundreds of eggs, the total number of monarch butterflies is greater or increases through the summer. Before the summer ends, there are once again millions and millions of monarchs all over the U.S. and southern Canada. The annual cycle takes place in 1 year. Get my map up here for you. There you go. All right. So we know that there are several monarch life cycles in one annual cycle. We have the fall migration, where they travel south, a spring migration, where they start to move north. They produce 2 or 3 generations of new butterflies. The cycle starts again, and they begin to migrate south. In the overwintering areas, scientists are able to actually measure areas where the monarchs are overwintering. And by measuring these areas, we're able to actually get population. So in the winter, we can measure these areas for populations and find out how many monarchs made it to the overwintering areas in California and Mexico. Later in the winter, before they leave, we measure these areas and find out how many monarchs survive the winter. Let's look at this in pictures. If I can get my pointer up here for you. We know that on the southern migration, these monarchs are nectaring and roosting in trees overnight on the long flight south to Mexico and east to California coast. They're nectaring to gain weight, roosting in trees for protection. In the overwintering areas, they're gathering together in large clusters or roosts, staying warm, sometimes coming down on warmer days to drink water and going back to the roost at night. Then in the spring, when the days get warmer, they start to stream down. In about March, they start to move further north. They're nectaring and looking for milkweed to lay their eggs on and producing the new generations of monarchs. These eggs and caterpillars are producing new adults, again moving further north towards Canada, new generations till they meet that last generation of monarchs that will live 8 to 9 months, and they'll begin their southern migration again. The one thing I want you to carry away from this today is how important the milkweed is, because every single monarch came from a single milkweed. So I want to go ahead and turn this over to Karen. I want to thank you for having me here today, and I'll talk to you a little later in the program.
Okay. Well, thanks, Cathy. That was a great introduction. Like Cathy said, I'm Karen Oberhauser. There's a picture of me, and you can see me on the side there. But I wanted to show this picture. Even though I'm a university professor, I actually spend a lot of time with kids. And these are some of the kids that came to our lab one time, and we showed them our greenhouse where we grow milkweed for caterpillars. So I kind of want to start with a little bit of a trick question here. Those of you that are watching in classrooms can talk about, is this a monarch butterfly that you're seeing in this picture? And if you said no to this question, you're right. This is actually not a monarch. This is called a viceroy. So it is a little bit of a trick, but viceroys fool a lot of other other animals that would try to eat them because monarchs taste bad, as Cathy said, because they eat milkweed. So the viceroy pretends that it's a monarch so that other things don't eat it. But we can tell the difference between monarchs and viceroys. If you look on the back wing of this viceroy, you can see an extra line, an extra vein. It looks like a wing vein that lets you tell the difference between viceroys and monarchs. Okay, but this picture really is of monarchs. I'll stop fooling you now. This is a picture of monarchs in the overwintering sites in Mexico. And I would bet that none of you have ever seen this many monarchs at one time, unless you've been in Mexico or California when they're wintering. But I just wanted to make the point here that this is a picture with a lot of monarchs. But if we think of an individual female monarch, she can lay up to 500 eggs in her lifetime. And if you think about that, if every single one of those eggs became a monarch butterfly, the whole world would look like the sites in California or in Mexico. It wouldn't just be here. So an interesting question becomes, because monarchs can lay over 500 eggs in their lifetime, why isn't the whole world just covered with monarch butterflies? So we're going to think about that question for a little bit here. And the main reason, the main answer for that question is that there are lots and lots of things that eat monarchs. And most of these things are insects, and most of them eat the monarchs when they're either eggs or caterpillars. So the picture down in the bottom right here of your screen, and for some reason my little arrow isn't working, but you can see the red velvet spider mite. And that is related to spiders. It's a mite. Thank you, who's ever moving the arrow. That's eating an egg. And right above that is an assassin bug nymph that's eating a second instar caterpillar. So Cathy told you about the instars. And then we have some ants that are eating a fourth instar caterpillar and a stink bug. So there are lots and lots of things that eat monarchs when they're caterpillars. Stink bugs are really interesting because they don't have teeth, they can't chew. So this stink bug is sticking its proboscis into the caterpillar and injecting it with an enzyme that turns the inside of the caterpillar kind of into a soupy mush. So it's kind of like a milkshake. That was supposed to be a joke. Hopefully you're laughing. Okay, so here are things that eat them when they're caterpillars. Only about 2 to 5% of caterpillars get to turn into pupae and then adults. So that's why we don't see so many monarchs. And there are, we're talking here about predators. So all of these are predators. And these are animals that live by killing and eating other animals. So here's a bunch of predators. Here's another picture of a monarch predator. This is a praying mantis, and this has caught a monarch adult. So there are things that eat the adults as well as the caterpillars. All right, so here are some other things that are natural enemies of monarchs. And Cathy showed you a picture when she was illustrating all the different orders of insects. She showed you a picture of a tachinid fly. And fly is something that lays its eggs. So here's the adult tachinid fly down at the bottom. That lays its eggs on caterpillars, and the eggs hatch and become maggots or larvae inside the monarch larva. And sometimes the monarch pupates and sometimes it doesn't, but these little maggots come out of the monarch and they always kill it. So this is an example of another natural enemy of monarchs. Here's another one that we've studied in our lab, and you're gonna see some of these up close. But this is a wasp. It doesn't have a common name. It's just called Teramalis cassotis. That's the only name we have for it. And it lays its eggs on the pupa. So this wasp is laying eggs on the pupa, the green pupa of a monarch. And then those eggs develop inside the pupa, and the picture above that is the pupae of the wasp that are developing inside a monarch. Now, because the monarch is still alive for most of the time that these flies and wasps are developing, it's not a true predator because they don't eat and kill their prey right away. So these are called parasitoids. And parasitoids are insects that live inside their living host. So the caterpillar is still alive, but it's got these little maggots living inside it, and they always eventually kill it. And there's one other kind of natural enemy of monarch. Oh, actually, before I wanted to get that, I wanted to just tell you that we're studying both these flies and these wasps in our lab. And all of these pinned flies in this picture are flies that volunteers in the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project sent to us at the University of Minnesota. And we then identified thousands and thousands of these flies. Okay, so now we're going to switch over, and this is kind of a gory little video clip here. So hopefully it won't give you nightmares at night. But this is a video clip that was taken by a graduate student in our lab, and you're going to see these wasps. So here you can see 2 weeks ago, one of these wasps laid eggs, or oviposited, into this monarch butterfly chrysalis. And here you can see a little wasp, so this tells you how big they are. And these offspring of the female are starting to emerge from the host. And they chew a little hole, so these are males that are coming out. They chew a little hole in the chrysalis, and then the wasps crawl out. So here we see two. And then we skip to 2 minutes later. Okay, now you can see some more wasps crawling around on the pupa. They've started to come out. You're seeing more and more of them coming out. And you can actually see these wasps are mating in here. So these are males that are just mating with their sisters. We call this sib mating, because only one female lays eggs in the pupa. And we see more crawling out. And now we're going to go speed up a little bit just so you can see how many are coming out. So these are more wasps coming out of the hole, crawling around on the top of the cage, and they just keep coming and coming. And in some cases, there can be up to 200 wasps in a single monarch pupa. Now, we know that this wasp is native to North America, where we are, but it's really difficult to study in the wild because it's so hard to find monarch chrysalids or pupae. So if you ever see this, we'd be really interested in your observations. All right, we're not going to see the whole video, but even more of them come out. So like I said, I hope you don't get nightmares from watching that. Okay, I'm going to put my little picture back on. Okay. Pretty well. So now we're going to go back to the slides. Okay, another kind of natural enemy for monarchs is called a parasite. And this is a parasite that lives on the surface of the adult monarch in these little tiny spores, these little tiny things that are kind of shaped like footballs in this picture. And you can see the scales from the monarch abdomen mixed in with these little tiny things that are the spores. And these are parasites. And a parasite is an organism that lives in or on another organism, and it's getting nutrients from the monarchs. It harms the host, but it doesn't always kill it. So it's different from a predator and a parasite because it can live on the living host. So here you see a monarch pupa that has been infected. So the caterpillar gets infected, and as the caterpillar develops into a pupa, these parasites migrate to spaces. So each one of the dots on this pupa that does not look very healthy is a whole bunch of spores from this parasite. You can see sometimes the adults can't come out of the pupa properly, so we see them kind of hanging and the wings haven't formed properly. But sometimes the infected adult looks like this, and we really can't tell if it's infected or not. So this is how the disease keeps going, because if this female lays eggs, she can transmit these spores to her offspring. So I want to just end by saying, and then we'll give you guys some time to give some ideas to us, but that everything that Cathy and I talked about in our presentation today was discovered by scientists. So all of our knowledge about monarch predators and parasites and parasitoids and the migration were discovered by scientists. But not all of these scientists were people like me who works at a university and gets paid for being a scientist. All of these things were discovered by a lot of people that just were really interested in monarchs. So I want to tell you a little bit about my life as a scientist. I do a lot of work outside, so that's me just about a week ago, out catching monarchs. I was out in the field, and you can see there's a lot of good nectar there for monarchs. This is goldenrod, which we have a lot of up in Minnesota. So we do field work. We also do some work outside on our campus. So this is the University of Minnesota campus, and these are some cages that we set up on a lawn so that we could study the monarch's behavior, how long they lived, how many times they mated. So this is outside work, but it's not really out in the field because the monarchs aren't living under their natural conditions. And then we do a lot of work in our lab. So the girl in this picture, Sarah, was actually a high school student when she worked in our lab, and you can see each one of these containers has a little monarch caterpillar in it, and Sarah fed them every day and measured them. So there's an example of our lab work, and we also use a greenhouse. So we grow a lot of plants for monarchs in a greenhouse, and there's an undergraduate, a college student in our lab who's doing to see how much monarchs eat. So she's got one caterpillar in each of those cages. So we work in a lot of different places. And sometimes we do some pretty weird things for monarchs. If we want to feed the adults easily, we just line them up at a little feeding trough like this and put a nut on their wings and then unwind their proboscis. So Cathy talked about the proboscis, and for some of these you can see that the proboscis is going into the honey water in this picture. So that might seem a little weird, and people ask me if they like it. I don't know. We've never been able to ask them that question, but they eat and they stay alive for a long time. So I just want to say that you too can be a citizen scientist or a monarch scientist. Here's a junior high girl that worked with us doing some studies of monarchs. She was observing monarchs at her school, so her teacher took her students outside, and they got to study monarchs. Or you can join a monarch citizen science project, and you can look up information about these 4 projects. Journey North, you can report monarchs during their migration. Monarch Watch, you can put tags on monarchs to study the migration. The Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, you can go out and look for eggs and caterpillars. Or Monarch Health, you can study the disease that I talked about that has the little spores. So lots of ways that you can join in the fun with monarch science. So now I want you to join in the fun a little bit and think about how we can help monarchs in their life cycle. So Cathy talked about 4 different stages of the monarch life cycle. Monarchs breed during the summertime. In the fall or the autumn, they migrate south, and then they get to Mexico and California, and they overwinter in these clusters, and then they migrate back north, laying eggs along the way. So I'm going to be quiet for a couple minutes, and I want you to talk with the people in your room and just pick one of these stages and think about what is something that you could do to help monarchs during that stage. And when you think of some answers, you can just type them into the chat box, and Shelby will tell us what you're saying.
As you're thinking about that, I just wanted to take an opportunity to say thank you to Karen and Cathy for sharing their knowledge with us today. We're going to move to a question and answer period now, but thanks to everyone who has participated thus far. We're so glad that you're here. Make sure that if you have questions, we've jotted down some of the questions you've asked throughout, and we'll ask them of Karen and Cathy soon. Make sure if you do have additional questions to put those in the chat box as well. We recorded today's webinar, so if you want to share it with your family and friends or come back and watch it again, it will be available online, and we'll send you those details in an email as soon as it becomes available.
I'm really excited to hear, Wendy, if anybody has any ideas for how they can help monarchs. We'd like to use your ideas. Otherwise, we can answer questions.
Sure. A few ideas about how to help. Provide early and late blooming nectar resources in a native wildflower meadow. Jennifer suggests grow milkweed. So if one doesn't have a garden, there are other ways. Kylie says to reduce or eliminate the use of pesticides.
Great.
So actually, those are all really good answers, and I just want to say something. Whoever said to grow milkweed or to grow nectar plants that are available for different kinds of nectar plants, that's really important because that can help them. If they're available in the summer, it helps them during their breeding time. If they're available in the fall, well, they're migrating south, or migrating north in the spring. So that's a really important answer. And of course, growing milkweed is really important too. Does anyone have any ideas about helping them in the wintertime?
Let me scan here. Someone suggests the importance of having place for them to roost in addition to obtain nectar.
Yeah, that's a good one.
That is a good one.
Develop way stations. Lots of people suggesting that planting habitat is important, which, way to go, that's number one. If anyone has suggestions for what we can do for monarchs in the winter, feel free to type them in the chat box. So far, no one has ideas.
Well, that's kind of a hard one because probably most of the people watching this don't live near area where monarchs overwinter. You probably live near places where monarchs breed in the summertime or migrate south or migrate north. But there are ways to help them in the winter, and that is to support conservation efforts in the winter. So a lot of schools actually raise funds for monarchs. There's an organization called the Monarch Butterfly Fund that supports conservation of the overwintering sites. So sometimes we can help species even when they don't live right next to us by supporting the people that do live in their area. So it's great that you have so many ideas for helping them where you live, but you can also help the people that live near them where they're wintering. So if there are any other questions that people had that didn't get answered in the chat box, we could answer those too.
Yeah, we have some really great questions, and hopefully Cathy will get her webinar going, or her camera going here, so that you have an opportunity to see everyone.
I don't know what happened to my camera. It just dropped. But I am here.
You'll have to restart it if you can find the button. But I'll jump into some questions. Let me switch pages here. Paula's class asked, why is the proboscis so long?
Oh, that is a really good question. The proboscis, and what's so interesting about that is different insect species have proboscis. The proboscis can be different lengths, and if you look at flowers, sometimes they have a long tube. The nectar is at the bottom of a long tube in the flower. So butterflies and moths and other insects that have a long proboscis can get into a deeper flower, and monarchs can nectar from both flowers that they have to reach into a long ways to get the nectar, and also really shallow ones. So they're more versatile because they have the long proboscis. It's a great question.
Hey, Wendy, I don't have the button for my camera up here, but I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have. It seems I've lost the capacity for my camera.
Okay. We will deal with that then. So another question regarding citizen science. Someone was interested in not only participating in citizen science, but are there opportunities to see the results of and use citizen science data?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So all three of the projects that I talked about, the three Monarch projects, have the data available online. For the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project that we run out of the University of Minnesota, you can actually see the data from individual people's sites. And that we can't get to the sites to actually show you that right now, but I'm actually going to switch. And whoever asked that question, my email is the second one listed here, and I'd be really happy to send you links. But we've really worked hard to make the data available and useful to teachers or other people.
Very good.
Thanks.
Cathy, there was a question. Someone noted that you said monarchs lay eggs on or near their food source. So the question was, do they really lay eggs on something besides milkweed?
Well, I haven't seen them lay on anything besides milkweed, but I suppose that if the milkweed was very sparse, that might be what is meant by near the milkweed. So there are also several different kinds of milkweed, and I think that near their food source might be more toward other types of insects, not the monarch specifically. The monarch can only use milkweed as a host plant. Karen, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, if they found monarch eggs on other kinds of plants, but usually it's a leaf, like a blade of grass that's right next to a milkweed plant. So for a monarch, as you said, Cathy, that is probably, they made a mistake. So they probably were on the milkweed plant, and when they moved their abdomen to lay the egg, it happened to end up on a piece of grass. That's rare, but it does happen every once in a while. But there are some species of butterflies, for example, the Carner blue butterfly, which is a butterfly we have up here. Well, it's not in Minnesota anymore, but it's in Wisconsin. They lay eggs near their host plant because the eggs are actually the stage that overwinters. So if they lay the host plant that they would lay an egg on in the fall it will die back. So they'll just lay eggs near that, and then in the spring, the newly hatched caterpillars will crawl onto a milkweed plant, or lupin plants. They don't eat milkweed; they eat lupin. So there are some insects that lay their eggs near their host plant.
Great. A class in Virginia wants to know, how do monarchs know it's their group of butterflies, when they're migrating in the fall, and what if they get lost?
Well, that's a brilliant question. And the reason I think that's so brilliant is because we really don't know the answer to that question. So if you see a whole bunch of butterflies on a tree, monarch butterflies on a tree when they're migrating south in the fall, we don't know if they've found each other on the tree, if on purpose they've all gone together at that same tree, or maybe there's just something about that tree that they all happen to go to it. So that's something that we really need to study more, is if they really are finding each other, or if we just see a lot of them in certain places because those places are so good. So that's a great question. And the same thing in Mexico. In Mexico, they probably are finding each other. It's pretty apparent when you watch them arrive at the overwintering sites in Mexico. They're just seeing each other on the trees. But on the fall migration, we don't really know. I've been with other monarch scientists who have tried to study that, and it's an unanswered question, so a good one.
Hopefully some of these kids that become citizen scientists will be able to help you with some data that will answer some of these questions for us.
Right.
Absolutely. I'm going to take just a few more questions here before we wrap up. I don't want to go too long over the hour. Someone was asking if there's been research done, I'll add either scientific or anecdotally, about the attractiveness of different either milkweeds or nectar plants for monarchs. Is a particular species more or less attractive?
Yeah, so there has been research done on that, but I think what's clear is that monarchs use a lot of different kinds of milkweed, and at different times of the summer, or spring, summer, or fall, some species are more attractive than others. So some of the species in the fall tend to get senesce, which is a word for just getting old. So what monarchs will do if they have a choice is they'll look for the best milkweed plants, and that might be plants of different species or even plants of the same species. It really wouldn't pay monarchs to have a strong preference for one milkweed or the other, because they usually only have one available to them at a time. And there are different species available to them in different places. So you should plant the species of milkweed that do the best in your area, and they'll use most of them. And for the nectar plants, we have lists on our website, and that too will depend on the season of the year. I'll just say that their absolute all-time favorite is blazing star. That's something that's just like a monarch magnet, but they will go to lots and lots of different kinds of flowers, and there's so many kinds. Ironweed, they like goldenrods, they like joe pie weed, they love milkweed, so they like dandelions. So leave a few dandelions in your yard. So there are lots and lots of flowering species that they like. What's their favorite in Texas, Cathy?
Well, I have to say the blazing star is another favorite here as well. And they particularly like the Maximilian sunflowers, which are found pretty much almost all over Texas. And they also really like the blue mist types of flowers, the bonesets, anything that has kind of that fuzzy bloom, like the eupatoriums. Anything in that family, they seem to really be attracted to those.
Yep, we find that too up here.
Cathy, there's a question about tag recoveries, and you being in Texas, this one pertains to you. Not that you've seen any, but maybe you've heard. Someone was wondering what the likelihood of recovering or resighting a spring remigrant tag in the southern U.S. might be.
Well, that's a really good question. I actually recently heard of a tag that was recovered from a tag, trying to find out whose it was. Somebody had tagged a fall migrant on the way down here, and we netted it in Texas before it got to Mexico. So that happens pretty frequently, that tagging that's being done in the north are getting netted here, and we're releasing them and trying to find out where they came from already. Tags coming up from Mexico, I haven't had too many in Texas. I would have to actually check on Monarch Watch's database to see what kind of recoveries might have come back up through Mexico. I don't think that it would be impossible because we're pretty close, especially in South Texas, to the Mexican border. But I don't personally know of a tag that's been recovered from the overwintering grounds through spring migration. But I do know of tags that have been recovered from people tagging in the north in the southbound migration.
And I've actually, to chime in, I've actually asked Chip that very question, if spring remigrants are recovered, and he said very few, if any, have been recovered during the spring migration.
They'd have to be, I think that they would have to be very close, very South Texas in order to see that happen. I know that we have some very worn monarchs that do come this, where I am in Central Texas. I do see some very worn monarchs. So I don't think that it would be impossible, but not very common.
Great. So my last question, it's in two parts, but segueing into sort of a broad question for getting more information. A little girl asks, how exactly do they suck nectar with their proboscis? And from that, segueing into where can I get more information?
I have a question. How do you know it was a little girl who asked the question? So if you've ever been to the doctor, when they prick your finger and they put like a little, it's called a capillary tube. It's a very thin glass tube on the little drop of blood on your finger, and that blood just goes up that tube. So it's a movement called capillary action, where the nectar they don't actually suck. So it's not like a straw. When you put a straw in something that you want to drink and suck it up into your mouth, they don't do that. They just stick their proboscis into the nectar, and capillary action moves it up. So you can go read about capillary action. It's just the movement of a liquid up a small tube. So it's different than sucking. But that's a really good question. And again, feel free to email Cathy or me about that. These were really fun questions.
Really fun.
Yeah, but we should probably sign off, Wendy.
Yep, that was my next step. I just wanted to get that one in there. So thanks again to everyone for joining us. We're going to end today's webinar and hope you'll join us again.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.